before. It's naturally acid. Does this mean it will burn your skin? Of course not. But it is nevertheless quite strongly acid. Now, the ocean went acid, not quite as acid as rainwater, for about 1200 years, 54 million years ago. So I said, well, in that case, when did the corals evolve? Presumably they all evolved after that, because otherwise, if these nitwits are to be believed, all the corals were keeled over and dissolved. And he said, funny you should ask that, because there are various kinds of coral. And he mentioned three kinds. The major kind, which are the toughest of the lot, are called the calcite corals. I said, when did they evolve? He said 650 million years ago, in the pre-Cambrian. So I said, can you explain that therefore 54 million years, 650 million years, how did they survive the acidification of the oceans that actually happened in that period, in the Paleocene, Eocene thermal maximum? And he said, well, the process is that if you put more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, that will combine with the superabundance of calcium ions in the ocean to make more corals. He said, they like a bit more CO2. And so I said, well, what about the more delicate aragonite corals? He said, well, they evolved in the Jurassic era, and you've all seen films about that, and that was therefore how long ago? Quite right, 175 million years of the tip of your toe. And so that too was before 54 million years ago, wasn't it? And so therefore these delicate aragonite corals also like a little bit more CO2 in their food, if you like. So then I said, all right, this caught him out. I said, what about the scleractinian corals? So well, they went extinct quite some time ago. Only it turned out he was wrong, because off Australia, just in the last couple of years, a colony of scleractinian corals, which had thought to have become extinct because of ocean acidification in the Paleocene, Eocene thermal maximum, were discovered off Australia of all places, and therefore they survived as well. So from this we know that the corals, which everybody is always bedwetting on about, do not mind having more CO2 in the ocean, which raises the question, how much CO2 is in the ocean already? Presumably they need some so that they can build their shells, or rather they can calcify, that's the Thomas word for shells. So, it turns out that there is 70 times as much carbon dioxide already in the ocean as there is in the atmosphere. So even if all of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was going to the ocean basically wouldn't notice.
No.
So they get round this by saying, but you see, the ocean is stratified, and if you suddenly put all that extra CO2 in the top stratum of the ocean, that would do incalculable damage to the various organisms there. Well, let's have a quick look at that one. There's a famous experiment done by a nitwit who was at the head of one of your silly agencies paid for by you as taxpayers, where she added some hydrochloric acid to seawater, and she said, look, then they put a shell in there, one of these seashells, and of course it dissolved in the hydrochloric acid. Now there were two things wrong with this. First of all, the concentration of hydrochloric acid was enormous. It would have dissolved, it wouldn't. And also, if you put hydrochloric acid into seawater, it actually drives the chemical reaction in precisely the opposite direction to what you would get if you put carbon dioxide into the ocean. So the experiments they did were totally useless. And it's no good telling them this. There are a small number of agitators who are trying to say, ocean acidification this, ocean acidification that. It's complete nonsense. So we can dismiss ocean acidification because these delicate corals, including even the little scleractinians, managed to survive the genuine acidification of the ocean that happened 54 million years ago. The question is, could we even make the ocean genuinely acid? Are we going to acidify the ocean at all? No. All that we might manage to do is cause a very small change, the absolute maximum of 30%, in the pH of the ocean, pushing it very slightly towards the neutrality, but it will still remain pronouncedly alkaline. So whatever we did, even if we'd done all the CO2 in the atmosphere into the ocean, it would still be alkaline. So it's just not going to do any damage. So that rules out ocean acidification. But what about all the other consequences of putting CO2 in the atmosphere that they bedwet on about? These bedwetters. What else is going to happen? Can anybody name the biggest threat that they bang on and on about and say it's getting worse all the time? Pollution. Sea levels. Sea levels. Oh, quite right. That is the mother of all schools. This is the one they go on and on about. Actually, without sea level rise, there's not very much that they could really say was going to become harmful.
A year ago in Boston Magazine, they had photoshops of Venetian gondoliers paddling up where people start meeting us.
Oh yeah, and they've done endless photoshops like this. There's a guy in London called Lyle Maguire, he's known as, and he was the professor of the impact of climate change at University College London. And he's a totally absurd figure. He's paid an absolute fortune by some nitwit organisation, I forget which of the various corporations, thinks it's profitable to it to keep the left on side by paying him. But he spends his whole time doing fancy artwork showing the Houses of Parliament, which are of course on the River Thames, disappearing beneath the waves. To which my reply was, and your problem is? Of course that does mean the House of Lords will go underwater as well, but of course I'm a Catholic, we can walk on water anyway. So sea level rise is the big scare, and they're trying to tell us that there has been an acceleration in the rate of sea level rise. Now in the 20th century we were able to measure sea level rise by using tide gauges all over the world. Anyone know one obvious problem with tide gauges? No, you can fix them so that they don't rise with the tide. It's a nice idea, but you're kind of thinking on roughly the right line. Now the problem is that the land tends to go up and down. And with the land going up and down, this is a real problem. It skews the tide gauge. If you can't tell whether the sea level rise or fall has been caused by a fall and rise of the land. So you have to calibrate for that.
That's the case.
And these days you can calibrate using satellite altimetry. You can use GPS to make sure that the land hasn't changed its height, and if it has changed its height, you can allow for that. And the cleverer tide gauges that they have now installed do exactly this. And so the tide gauges are actually the most accurate way, once you've made a correction for what is called the isostatic rebound of the land following the last ice age, when a lot of ice was thrown off. After all of this here was under a mile of ice until 9,000 years ago. And then there was real global warming. And it wasn't caused by our SUVs, because there kind of weren't any at that time. And all that ice ended up in the sea. Then you've got real sea level rise. In fact, in the last 11,000 years, there's been something like 400 feet of sea level rise. So sea level rise is a perfectly natural phenomenon. And how much sea level rise was there in the last century? 7 inches. Well, now the question is, they say, but of course with the warming of the planet, it's always sea level rise. And so they began measuring the sea level by satellite altimetry. So just using it to calibrate the height of the land on which the tide gauge is stood. They began using it to measure the tops of the waves directly by bouncing radar and lasers off them. Trouble was that the wavelength of the radars they were using was about 20 times longer than the annual change in sea level that they were measuring. So in fact, they were simply guessing. And on top of that, there was another problem, and that was that they've had 3 generations of these sea level satellites just since 1993. They keep changing them. And the intercalibration errors between each satellite and the next comfortably exceed the sea level over the entire period of measurement. So in other words, the satellite altimeters are entirely useless for measuring sea level rise. The tide gauges are in for the tide gauges, as best we can make out, and the great expert in this is Professor Niklas Mörner of the University of Stockholm, who's an old friend of mine and with whom I will be at a conference in Porto beginning of next month on all this. He told me some time ago, and he has not had to revise his forecast since, that the amount of sea level rise over the coming century will be 2 inches, plus or minus 6 inches. There's a certain amount of uncertainty there. So that means at most there will be 8 inches of sea level rise over the next century. And as Dr. Willie Sue, one of my co-authors, said at Camp Constitution just this morning, he said, if you cannot step back and get out of 8 inches worth of sea level rise, then you deserve to drown. So really, that's really all one needs to say about sea level rise. It's simply not going to be a problem. So you can forget that. Yes, sir?
Sorry. Where kind of find the information on that, the error bars you're talking about?
Certainly, you could go to a paper by, I don't remember who it is now,
we can chat later about that.
Sorry?
If you want to figure that out later, that's cool. I don't want to take up your time.
Yes, it's near Emmerdale 2006, if I remember right. Clear. If it's wrong, I'll get in touch and tell you your contest. Yes, sir.
Okay, thanks.
Simply as a frame of reference, we're going to want to picture. What is the percentage of CO2 to the entire composition of the Earth's atmosphere?
Right, certainly. It is 0.04%. And often what I do is I ask people what it is, and they say, oh, it's 10%, it's 20%, it's 50%. It's actually 0.04%. And 100 years ago, it was 0.03%. So it's gone up by 0.01%, which is 1 part in 10,000 in the last 100 years, which is not that much. However, because of the way the radiation works, even that small increase in CO2 can, in theory, cause global warming, which is why, for the purposes of the calculation I did for you here, to get to that 1.17 Kelvin of equilibrium warming per doubling of CO2, and therefore 1.17 Kelvin, roughly speaking, in the next 100 years from all sources, that's roughly how it works. I simply assumed that they were right about all these concentrations, they were right about the amount of warming it would cause. I haven't argued with that, even though it's only a very small perturbation of the atmospheric composition. They are probably right to say that it is going to cause something like 1 Kelvin of warming per doubling of CO2 directly before you take account of feedback. Now, it is fair to say that there have been some compelling challenges. In particular, Professor Hermann Harder, who communicated with me yesterday on this, has calculated that the estimated warming from CO2 has been overstated by 30%. Separately, in a talk given 4 years ago at the World Federation of Scientists, Professor Will Hacker, at a meeting that I attended, said that they had, for different reasons, overestimated it by 40%. Therefore, if you combine those two, it's overestimated by 82%. And you could be looking at as little as 0.6 to 0.7 Kelvin for the direct warming from CO2, and that would make it about 3/4 of a Kelvin after you've taken account of feedback. Effectively, what we have proven is that the feedbacks, that are where they get the big warming from, can actually be ignored altogether in the calculation of equilibrium sensitivity with very little error. So CO2, you're quite right to ask these questions, that even though there's a very, very small concentration in the atmosphere, it is possible that that will cause the sort of warming that they say, subject to the corrections by Professor Hacker and Professor Harder. And so we can't just say that because there's very little of it in the atmosphere, because we've added it still less, therefore it won't have an effect. There are good reasons to suppose that it will have an effect, though not a very large one. So that, I hope, answers that question. It's a very good question. Do anybody else have any questions before I go on to them? Oh yes, lots. So we'll start with you.
Not a question, but it was pointed out to me a couple of years ago, I believe by Mike Adams at naturalnews.com. If you want to feed the planet and eliminate starvation, increase the CO2 by 10%. Plants love it.
Yeah. That's the point we were making earlier, and you're absolutely right. I agree with you 100%. It's no doubt it's the fastest fertilizer of plants there is, and indeed the process by which we see the net primary productivity of plants increasing, and there are several papers on this giving the satellite imagery and so forth, is known as CO2 fertilization, much to the fury of the left, who cannot find a good word to say for CO2. Extremely good point, say yes, sir.
I want to go to the output end, which is the proof is in the pudding, and that is the temperatures.
Right.
And we have a temperature record, we have a temperature history. Now,
Yes.
the little that I've read suggests that almost all the data is corrupted, for
Yes.
except maybe the satellite,
Correct.
which only goes back about 40 years. That's the problem.
That's absolutely right. And I can give you something about these records. First of all, there are two satellite records, one of which was tampered with after I had predicted that it would be. And I'll tell you the story of that. This was about, 2 or 3 years ago. There was a debate in Congress about climate change, sponsored by Senator Ted Cruz of Texas, whom I had actually met and spoken for on the stump when he was campaigning. So I'd been on the rubber chicken circuit with him, I knew him well, and so when he got in touch with the Heartland Institute that I advised, and asked for one single graph that would tell the story of why global warming hadn't proven to be what they thought it was, what would that graph be? And I submitted a graph that I compiled for a program where I take the data from the satellites and I compile the ups and downs of the temperature, then I take the trend and calculate that so you can see what happens. And at the time when this debate took place, as luck would have it, there had been no global warming at all for 18 years and 9 months. So that graph, and I said that in that 18 years and 9 months, something like a third of all man's impact on the climate had occurred, and the temperature hadn't triggered at all. So he showed that graph, and it was very funny watching the Democrats trying to answer this. They had really no answer. They had an Admiral Twitler, I think he was called, who tried to say that, of course, this was too short a period to make a... Yet if they get 1 week, as they have this week, this is the hottest week on record, this is all because of global warming. But 18 and a half years, 18 and 3/4 years, with no global warming at all, that's not enough to establish a trend. So there have been these very long periods with no warming at all. And so I predicted that after that debate, in which the Democrats were completely humiliated because of this one spectacular graph that I'd done for Ted Cruz, the people who compiled the data set I was using, which was the remote sensing systems data set, would decide to change it. And they'd tamper with the data in the way that all 3 of the terrestrial data sets had Group KISS and NOAA. They'd all tampered with their data sets to make it look as though the warming of the latter half of the 20th century and the first bit of the 21st was much greater than it actually was when they originally measured it. And so RSS then, exactly as I had predicted, did the same and tampered with their data so as to show a small amount of warming over the period where I'd said there hadn't been any. And so thereby they wiped out the global warming pause. However, there is one honest data set, and that's kept by Doctors John Christie and Roy Spencer at the University of Alabama at Huntsville. And so these redneck hicks from the south, who are in fact rocket scientists, they actually designed the satellite microwave sounding units by which they measure by some peculiar process. I don't pretend to understand what the temperature is at various layers in the atmosphere down to sort of the 5 miles where we live. They corrected their data set in the other direction. They had always shown more than everybody else, and they realized that they'd got a mistake in the way their satellite operated, because there was some spurious heating coming from one of the units on the satellite. When they corrected for that, they then got less of a warming than everybody else shows. So now I use their data set as the normative data set, and that shows that the rate of warming since they first began measuring it, I think in December 1978, has been equivalent to 1.2 or 1.3 Celsius per century, which is more or less exactly in line with the 1.2 Celsius per century that our very simple mathematics here would lead us to expect. And the other data sets range up to 2 Celsius per century equivalent, over the same period. But the IPCC originally predicted 2.8 Celsius per century equivalent as their best estimate, anything up to about 4.5 Celsius per century, and that simply hasn't happened. And the rate of warming, taking the average of one terrestrial and one satellite data set, that's the UAH and the HADCRUD, which is the oldest of the data sets, and that's the one the IPCC, is approximately 1.5 Celsius per century, and I guess that's probably the fairest estimate that one can make of what has actually happened. And that also is not very far from the 1.2 that we predict. Yes?
Now, Massachusetts, as you may or may not know, is a big hockey state. Hockey, we love hockey. Do you have anything either funny or scientific to say about the dreaded hockey stick formation that they keep showing us over
I'll
and over
explain
again?
what this is, and of course it's really the hokey stick graph, because it's complete nonsense. And it was compiled by a supposed climatologist at Penn State University by the name of Michael E. Mann. And he eventually sued a Canadian comedian called Mark Starr for saying that instead of being at Penn State, he should have been in the state pen. And Michael Mann, who, like all communists, has absolutely no sense of humour, did not see the funny side of this and was unable to turn it into a joke. So he decided to sue. And then he got into trouble because immediately Mark Stein's people, who were pretty clever, they said, well, we would like to see all the calculations that you used in order to produce the hokey stick graph. And of course, I don't think, the last I had heard, even though the judge had ordered those calculations to be produced and various other emails and associated materials with this highly questionable graph, Michael Mann had not, the last time I looked, which is admittedly some time ago, had not produced them. And therefore I think that particular court case is gradually going to fade into distance. He's either going to have to produce them, in which case it's all over for him, because they're not going to
If you
do
read
well.
Stein, what he says is, Mann's people have no intention of allowing this to actually come to a trial, which his side would happily expedite. They're punishing him by bleeding in white with legal fees.
I imagine that that is typical, because Mann, of course, has all the resources of international communism at his command. And so, whereas Mark Stein, we are much less generous and indeed much less rich now than communists. So we can't help him out to the degree necessary.
This brings me to the point in our conversation about how you said it was all contrived and buttressing what you said about the hockey stick chart.
Yes.
Expand upon our conversation earlier in the car about how this is all, I mean, it's simply just made up. They just
Now,
invented
I have
this.
mentioned the word communism, and I'm going to explain why I say this so openly. Now we have to go back to 1945. Is that the way you'd like me to start? Yes. All right. We're going to go back to 1945. Now that was the end of the Second World War, and the Allied armies under General Patton had advanced very successfully to the outskirts of Berlin, where it was decided by the High Command, by the political authority, that they would stop and allow General Zhukov, with the Russian army coming from east, to enter Berlin and have the honour of doing that in recognition of Zhukov's brilliant campaign to defeat Nazism in Russia. That proved to be a heroic strategic mistake. Not only did it lead eventually to the Berlin Wall and all that nonsense, but also the one Reich's Ministry building still left standing after we carpet bombed Berlin. It was really appalling what little was left of Berlin after we finished it, was the Reichspropagandaamt of Joseph Goebbels in Mauerstraße. That was then the largest office building in Europe. It's still standing to this day. It's still used as a government office building. It's now, by a curious irony, the Department of Social Security. But at that time, it was the Ministry of Propaganda. And in the files there, none of which had been destroyed, because Goebbels had ended up believing his own propaganda, and he had actually believed that the 1000-Jahrisches Reich was actually going to last for 1,000 years. He had left all the files in place, and they got the lot. And the big question that anyone who loves German civilization has always asked is how did they become a nation of monsters in so short a time? What happened? Was it just the inflation of the Weimar Republic and the general chaos after the First World War, the reparations demanded by the Versailles Treaty? There were all sorts of factors. But the main factor was how Goebbels had managed to shut everybody up who was proving effective in opposing Nazism before Nazism took power. And they did this by a brilliantly simple technique. They trained all members of the Nazi party that every time somebody spoke up in Germany and proved themselves to be effective in attacking Nazism, that person's personal reputation would be trashed. He would be accused of being a paedophile, a homosexual, an abortionist, all manner of accusations were leveled. And this would get into the newspapers that they controlled, it would be on the radio, it would be passed around by word of mouth until that person's reputation was trashed. Now that did not silence the few brave people who spoke out and had their reputations trashed, but it did silence everybody else, because they might have wanted to join with those who were opposing Nazism and doing so publicly and speaking out publicly. But if you know that the consequence of your speaking out is that your reputation will be trashed, you keep still. And that's how they did it. They silenced all opposition, apart from a few gallant souls who didn't give in, and all of them were rounded up and executed within weeks of Hitler taking power. Now the Russians, of course, when they found these files, when Zhukov's army came and they found these files, the KGB came straight in to analyse everything. Within 1 month, they had set up the Gossudarственная Desinformation, the disinformation directorate. And how did this work? Well, it was very simple. They were already in control in Russia, so they didn't need to do this in Russia. If anybody spoke up effectively against communism in Russia, that was the end of them. Off to the camps, off with their head, whatever. But they were international socialists, whereas the Nazis had been national socialists. They wanted to spread communism worldwide. So they had the same problem in the rest of the world as the Nazis had had in Germany. They needed to silence all publicly vocal opposition to communism. So they set up this new directorate just to do that and nothing but that, to recruit willing Western communists, and you can imagine just how many there are of those, quite a lot, and not even pay them, but just get them to provide attack after attack after attack in every medium they could get control of. And if you wonder why it is that all the news media have suddenly gone communist, they've been working for decades to take them all over, so that they can make sure that anybody who, say, like me, speaks out against global warming, which is Communist Party policy to make a fuss about, we have our reputations trashed. You only have to look at my creepy media entry, and you'll see that they make me out to be a complete monster. Nothing I can do to change it, because it's controlled entirely, actually, by one communist. I know who he is. And one day I shall deal with him. But for the moment, there it is. And they trash our reputations still to this day. Now, the man who was put in charge of this was the head of the secret police in Ceausescu's Romania. I'm only able to tell you any of this because it's now more than 30 years since Pacepa, who was the man who was the head of the secret police, Ion Mihai Pacepa, came out to the West and told us everything. Only now can I talk about this. And it was absolutely fascinating. He's a little dumpy man with those very heavy sort of Soviet-era black-rimmed spectacles with thick pebble lenses. And he sits there, sort of looks at you. And this was a very, very clever man. And he had already realized that Ceausescu was an idiot, because he wrote me a very nice message just 10 days ago. He sent me his book, which is called Deconstructing. It tells the story of how he set up and ran the disinformation directorate. Their first target, incidentally, was Pope Pius XII, and I'll come on to that in a moment. But in this book he tells a wonderful story. In his little dedication to me, he says, "Congratulations on your fighting against communism and progressivism throughout the world." And he said, when I once met Ceausescu for a morning meeting, I reported to him that every egg we were selling to the West from our farms was costing us 50 cents. His reply was, in that case we will swamp them with quantity. And he realized then he was dealing with a maniac. And so when the KGB got in touch and said, would you like to come and run this new directorate? He said, yes, please, but he was desperately went for somebody halfway sane. So he then set up the directorate, and his first task was to recruit willing communists in the West to act as the unpaid agents, trashing people's reputations. And so they soon recruited people who were willing to help. They began on Pope Pius XII because they regarded the Pope as the most dangerous anti-communist in the world. So they began putting out stories to the effect that he was a Nazi-loving Jew hater who had compromised with the Nazis throughout the war. How many of you have heard that story about him? Very nearly all of you. That shows just how effective that propaganda was. Now at first, as Pacheco says, for a few years it didn't work at all. But then it began to work. And then eventually everybody believed it, even as recently as 1987, when I was working for the Evening Standard. One of the more idiotic colleagues on the paper saw an article in the New York Review of Books, which was long, totally under Pacheco's control, on the front page saying, that it was in 1987 that Pope Pius XII had been a Nazi-loving Jew hater. And this idiot on the Evening Standard right away, he said, oh, I think we should reproduce this article. It's a very important article. I said, no, there's a long history behind this, but I couldn't say how I knew. So I couldn't stop them printing this rubbish, so I was able to reply to it in the column that I had in the paper the following day, to try and set the record straight. But that's how effective this propaganda was. So much so that in 1979, I gave lunch to Anthony Rhodes, who was a great Anglican scholar who had been so horrified by these stories of the Pope compromising with Nazis that he decided he would write a book dedicated to exposing every historical detail of what the Pope had done. He was really angry about it. So he started research, and by 1979 he had realized that it was complete nonsense. And he said to me, I am baffled, I can't understand how the Pope ended up with this reputation. Because I just sit there, oh, I can't write it. He wrote a book, he changed it, he wrote the book, it's called Vatican in the Age of the Dictator. And it said the complete opposite of what he had started out to write. And among the things he points out in that book, which my grandfather had in his library and I still got it in mind, it says that what did they do? The Pope was so popular with the Jews in Rome that after the war, both the chief rabbi and his deputy had become Catholics. And when I was invited by the Israeli government to go and, among other things, see the Yad Vashem memorial to the Holocaust in Israel, the largest plaque on the wall there commemorating those who helped to prevent the Holocaust from minimizing is to Pope Pius XII. So there's absolutely no truth in this. In fact, from another book that I had, which my grandfather had in his library, I knew that the Pope in 1937, before he became Pope, he was still